Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. And let me say a little bit about Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books in the Bible. It was written by Solomon sometime around 930 BC. So you're talking about a book that's over 3,000 years old. And I'll be honest with you, it's a little difficult to understand unless you understand a little bit about Hebrew. You understand how to use reference material, because over 3,000 years, the way they spoke, the way we speak with Hebraisms, which is Jewish figures of speech, sometimes it's very difficult to understand. So you read through the book of Ecclesiastes and you think, oh my gosh, I didn't understand anything in the book. But really, it's quite easy to understand once you know a few things. But chapter 3 is a very interesting chapter because this chapter explains how life works. And oh, how I wish I had known this information when I was younger. In fact, I wish my dad would have sat me down and explained this to me, because it would have saved me a lot of heartache. And it would have saved me a lot of time searching for answers and questioning God as to why this happened or why that happened. It would have allowed me to obtain success so much earlier in my life, because this chapter also explains the role that we play in determining the quality of our life. You see, sometimes we think that life's just good for some people and it's bad for others, and it's not really the case. You see, to a large extent, we determine whether we have a great life or a crappy life. Believe it or not, it's not the circumstances that determine that, whether we have a good life or a crappy life. It's the way we react to the circumstances that determine whether we have a good life or a crappy life. So, this is something that I wish I would have known earlier in life. It's also something I wish I would have taught my children. I think it would have given them a better understanding of life in general, and it would have taught them the proper way to act and react to things that have been thrown to them or thrown at them in life. You see, some of the things you can prepare for and even avoid by doing the right things. However, there are times when you've done all of the right things, but life still throws you a curveball, and it seems everything goes to pot. And you're wondering, why in the world did that happen to me? Well, I hate to tell you this, but that's the way life works. And how you act or react when that happens determines the outcome. So let's look at what Solomon had to say about life and the way it works, and what our proper response should be when things are thrown at us that we really don't understand. So let's start with verse number 1, because verse number 1 lays the foundation for the rest of the chapter. In fact, if you misinterpret verse 1, you miss the whole point of chapter 3. I can't tell you the number of commentaries I have in my library on the book of Ecclesiastes that are almost worthless when it comes to chapter 3, because they misinterpreted verse 1. And if you misinterpret verse number 1, you screw up the rest of the chapter. So notice what verse 1 says. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. Now, Calvinists claim that this verse proves that God predestines every event that takes place, that nothing happens that's not God's will, and that He didn't foreordain. In fact, if you don't mind, let me read a portion from Edward Palmer's book, The 5 Points of Calvinism. And if you haven't figured it out, he's a Calvinist. If you haven't figured it out, I'm not a Calvinist. But here's what he had to say. This is what he wrote. In fact, you'll find this on pages 24 and 25 in his book, The 5 Points of Calvinism. He writes, foreordination means God's sovereign plan whereby He decides all that is to happen in the entire universe. Nothing in this world happens by chance. God is in back of everything. Let me say that again. Nothing in this world happens by chance. God is in back of everything. He decides and causes all things to happen that do happen. You have a flat tire, God caused that. You have cancer, God caused that. Your spouse dies, God caused that. Someone gets raped, God caused that. Someone gets murdered, God caused that. Listen, this is what they believe. God predestines everything. He decides and causes all things to happen that do happen. He has foreordained everything after the counsel of His will. The moving of a finger, the beating of a heart, the laughing of a girl, the mistake of a typist, even sin. So if you screwed up, bless your heart, it's not your fault. That was God's will. Now, if you believe that, come on up here and I'll slap the fire out of you. And don't get mad. Because that's God's will. Or I wouldn't have done that. Now, what Calvinists claim, this verse is saying, is that God predestines every event that happens down to the very second. That he has predestined a time for everything. But people, that is not what Solomon is saying. And I can prove it to you. You see, the Jews had two different words for time. Moed and eighth. Moed was the word the Jews used to refer to a specific time, such as it's now 10:28. Or you're going to go and meet someone for lunch after this at 11:32. That's what moed means. It refers to a specific time or specific moment in time. In fact, let me give you an example of how this word is used in another passage of Scripture so you'll understand what moed really means. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 35. If you remember the story, David's telling Jonathan, your dad's trying to kill me. And Jonathan says, oh no, David, he's not trying to kill you. He said, yes, he is. And Jonathan says, I'll tell you what, I'll sit at dinner with him and I'll find out whether he wants to kill you or not. And if he's trying to kill you, here's what I'll do. You meet me at a certain time in this field, and if he's trying to kill you, I'll shoot the arrow past you, and when the little boy or lad goes out to get the arrows and retrieve them for me, I'll tell him, oh, it's further, and that tells you to run. If I don't shoot it very far, and I say, oh, no, it's back this way, you'll know my dad's not trying to kill you. All right, now, that's the story, but I'm only going to read one verse. This is verse 35. And it says, and it came to pass in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field at the time appointed with David. A specific time. Not sometime in the morning, not sometime in the afternoon, maybe right after breakfast. No. He went at the time appointed with David and a lad with him. In other words, they had a specific time that Jonathan was supposed to go out into the field, and that's when Jonathan did. Eighth, on the other hand, didn't refer to a specific moment in time, but to a situation or an occasion that's right for something. Let me give you some examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. If I said it's time to take out the trash, I'm not saying that because every day at 10:30 I take the trash out whether it's full or not. No, that's not what I'm saying. I don't have a specific day in which I do that or a specific time in which I do that. No. What I mean by that is that I need to take out the trash because it's full. The circumstances dictate that it's time to take out the trash. Now, some of you live with other people who never know when it's time to take out the trash. When my girls lived at home, we have the trash bag that you pull out the little counter or it's little drawer you pull out, the trash can's in it. I guarantee you couldn't push it back in, so they wouldn't even do it. They just keep piling things on to see how high they could get it before it all came crumbling down. That was a sign to Dad that it's time to empty the trash, to take it out, and to put a new trash liner in. Yeah. But I noticed when it was full that it was time to do that. That's what eighth means. Let me give you some more examples. If I say that it's time to mow the yard, what do I mean by that? I mean that the grass has grown to the point that it's kind of high and the grass needs to be cut. If the grass doesn't grow, I don't need to cut the grass. It's not time to mow. How many of you thank God that the freeze has come so you don't have to mow the grass anymore? Yeah. Well, I got to get out there and do that last little one. I'll wait till everything is dead, and then I'll get out there and I'll mow one last time and I'll weed eat. And then next year, when springtime comes, I get out the weed killer and the grass killer and I spray everything. And my wife gets so upset because if you come to my house, I don't like to weed eat. So you pull into the driveway, and instead of me weed eating, there's a dead patch about this wide all the way around. I don't like to weed eat. It's time to spray is my motto. But anyways, what if I say it's time to do the dishes? What do I mean by that? I mean we're running out of clean dishes. They're starting to pile up in the sink. And if you want a clean dish, don't just wash the dish you want. Do the dishes. Yeah, that's what the word eighth means. Now, when Solomon wrote there is a time for every event, he did not use the word moed. Which means he wasn't saying that God has predestined a specific time for every event that takes place. No. Instead, Solomon used the word eighth. So what he was saying was that circumstances determine when a particular event will happen or should happen. And then in verses 2 through 8, Solomon gives examples to illustrate his point. There's a time to be born. In other words, certain circumstances determine when it's time to give birth. A woman's water breaks, her cervix dilates, and she starts having contractions, and there'll come a time when she wants to push. It's time. I can't stop it. The circumstances dictate the baby's about to be born. And how many times does the OB-GYN walk in and say, now, honey, don't push yet. Women, what do you want to do? Just slap him or her right. I can't help it. I need to push. Yeah, there's a time to give birth. There's a time to die. And the circumstances will determine that time. If you have a heart attack and a section of your heart doesn't receive blood, that part of the heart is going to die. And if it's massive enough, you're going to go into cardiac arrest and you're going to die. And that's all there is to it. The circumstances dictated the event. It was time to die because of the circumstances. Now, if you get to the hospital in time and they realize you've got blockage and they put a stent in, balloon it, you're going to live a little longer. Well, God predestined that. No. This is not moed. This is the Hebrew word aith. Circumstances, the occasion determines it. Now, in every example, Solomon is emphasizing that it's the circumstances that determine when it's time for something to occur, which is very important, and let me explain why. To some degree, I can actually control the number of good times I have versus the number of bad times I have by controlling the circumstances. Yeah. I can actually control to some degree the number of good times I have versus the number of bad times I have by controlling the circumstances. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Is it possible to control the time of your death? Oh, yes, to some degree. You can exercise and eat right. You can control how safely you drive. You cannot smoke. You cannot take drugs. You can do a lot of things that are healthier for you. So you can actually prolong your life and put off the time of your death, but you can't control the aging process or your genetics. So in essence, you can't stop your death, but you can affect the time of your death. So the answer is yes, to a degree. That means you have a role to play in the quality of your life, but you can't control it completely. And that's what makes life so frustrating. Yeah. There are things I can control, but there are things I cannot control. In other words, I can control certain circumstances, but some circumstances are beyond my control. So that means that the majority of the time, I can control whether times are good or bad, but not all of the time. So it's possible to have more good times than bad by manipulating the circumstances that I'm able to control. But I can't stop all of the bad times because there are certain circumstances that are beyond my control. You see, sometimes we're just thrown into situations, or maybe it's the hand that we're dealt, where the circumstances are beyond our control. And those circumstances determine what time it is, not me. And people, that's what makes life so frustrating. So after he goes through all of these times, he gets to verse number 9. And in verse number 9 he says, what profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? Now the key word in this verse is toils. Toils is translated from the Hebrew word amel, and it means hard labor. Now, why is man working so hard in the first place? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because he's trying to control the circumstances so he'll have good times rather than bad times. But after working so hard, he finally throws up his hands in frustration and he says, what's the use? Now, why is he so frustrated? He's frustrated because he found out that you can work your butt off trying to do everything right. Handling your finances right, dating the right person, and ticking them off the list until you finally find a godly person and you marry them and you treat your family right and you help your community, and bad things still happen. Sometimes, out of nowhere, you're blindsided by circumstances that are beyond your control. And you go through a very difficult time. It's a horrible season in your life. And what would Solomon say about that? It's a time to weep. Yes, it's a time to weep. And it's so frustrating because there's nothing you can do about it, no matter how hard you try. But let's keep going because Solomon is not finished. Remember, in this entire chapter, he's going to explain to us how life works. Look at verses 10 and 11. I have seen the task. Very important word. Underline it. If you have a different translation, highlight that word that it uses. I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate. Another very important word. Underline it. In its time. He has also set eternity in their heart. Yet so, which is kind of hard to translate. In other words, it's kind of like a however. That man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. Now, notice that God has given a task to the sons of men while they're here on this earth to occupy themselves with. Now, before we look at what that task is, let's look at who he's given this task to. He's given to the sons of men. Now, the word men is not the normal Hebrew word for man, which is ish. Instead, it's the Hebrew word for Adam, Adam. So the literal translation would be, I have seen the task which God has given the sons of Adam with which to occupy themselves. Now, why would Solomon use the word Adam rather than the normal word for man, which is ish? Well, it's because he's alluding to the original problem. Think about it. What started the whole problem in the first place? In other words, why do bad things happen in this world? Well, bad things happen because Adam sinned and he alienated himself from God. And as a result of his sin, he became mortal and he screwed everything up. Not just his own life, but all of creation. If you don't believe that, just read Romans chapter 8. Even creation is groaning, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed so it can be redeemed from this curse that was placed upon it because of Adam's sin. Yeah. You see, by introducing sin in the world, Adam brought injustices, inequities, and all types of problems, such as sickness, disease, poverty, and catastrophes, etc. And many of these problems are beyond our control. We can't control if a tornado's coming our way. We can't control if there's going to be a hailstorm. Those things are beyond our control, which brings us to the task that God has given to us while we're here on this earth. In fact, this is very important. Every one of us has been given a task by God, and it's the same task. It might be carried out differently depending upon your occupation, but we're all given the same task that we're supposed to occupy ourselves with. So, what is the task that God has given to us while we're here on this earth? Well, our task is to know what time it is in our life and act appropriately. Let me say that again. Our task is to know what time it is in our life and act appropriately. In other words, there's a time to plant. So our task is to what? Plant. There's a time to uproot. So our task is what? To uproot. There's a time to weep. So our task is to weep. There's a time to laugh. That's a hard task. But we do it. We laugh. You see, we spend our whole life acting and reacting to whatever life throws at us. And sometimes we just want to sit down and cry. But our task is to deal with each season or circumstance or time appropriately as it comes. In fact, look at the first part of verse number 11. He has made everything appropriate in its time. Now, that's hard to understand, but let me try to explain what he means by this. He means that there's an appropriate response for each season of life. Yeah. It means that depending upon what time it is, there's an appropriate response. Look back at verses 1 through 8 and let's read what it says. There's an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven. Now, he didn't use the word moed, he used the word eighth. He's not saying there's this specific time that God's preordained. At 10:43, Alan is going to lift up his right arm. No. It means there are appointed times. There are certain times when circumstances or an occasion comes. Now, notice he's going to give some examples. A time to give birth. Your wife looks at you and says, "It's time." It's a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, which is planted, a time to kill. You don't just wake up one day and say, "It's time to kill." No, someone breaks into your house, a home invasion, and your life is threatened, and so is your family's. Let me tell you, it's time to kill. Or we're in a war. It's a time to kill. And a time to heal. There's a time for restoration. There's a time to tear down. There's a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. It's not time to hug. A time to search and a time to give up as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. So what that means is there's an appropriate time for everything. Now, the word appropriate means it's the right thing to do. So the task that God has given us is to do the right thing at the right time. Let me say that again, because if I were you, I would be taking notes. I'd write this down, because if you're a parent, you want to sit down with your kids and you want to explain this is the way life works. And you want to do it as early as possible when they understand abstract terms and concepts. You don't just want them to be when it's just concrete terms and concepts, but abstract. When they can understand this, you want to sit down and you want to explain how life works. So the task that God has given to us is to do the right thing at the right time. Because if we do the right thing at the right time, we're going to have more good times than we have bad times. If we don't do the right thing at the right time, we're going to have more bad times than good times. That's good teaching, Pastor Allen. So, when life throws something difficult at us, we don't give up. We don't take the easy way out. We do the right thing. We do the appropriate thing because it's our task. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse number 2 is a great example of this, and it's written to pastors. Yes, it's written to Timothy, but you need to understand this principle that he's teaching Timothy applies to every pastor. Notice what he said, or what he wrote. He said, "Preach the word. Be prepared in season and out of season. Correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction." I want you to notice what it's saying here. And most people have no idea what it means. He's saying, pastors, preach in season and out of season. Now, we don't talk like that. In fact, that's a horrible translation. Let me explain what that means. In season is translated from the Greek word eukairos, which literally means good times. Kairos means seasons. And again, it's more like eighth, not moed. It's referring to it's the season for watermelon, or it's the season for tomatoes. How many of you know it's the season for tomatoes? We start charcoaling hamburgers. Because a good hamburger requires a good tomato. Yeah. So, eukairos, the prefix eu means good. Kairos means time, so it means in good times. Bad or out of season is translated from the Greek word akairos, which means bad times. So what this is saying is, pastors, you be prepared to preach in good times and in bad times. Now, I've been pastoring full-time for 34 years. And let me just tell you, in 34 years, I've seen some good times. And I've seen some bad times. And it doesn't matter if they're bad times. I'm still required to get up and preach and not let anyone know I'm going through a bad time. It doesn't matter what I'm going through. The appropriate thing to do is preach. That's my task. To preach the good times, in the good times and in the bad times. When my mom passed away, I did her funeral, and I got up and I preached right after it. My father-in-law, he died on a Sunday morning. Got the phone call, went to the nursing home, came here, didn't say a word about it, and preached the gospel. Do you know why? Because it was the appropriate thing to do. It's my task to preach in good times and preach in bad times. To do the right thing at the right time. And for preachers, the right time is every time you have the opportunity to preach. So whether it's a good time or a bad time, I'm to preach the word. That's my task. Now, look at the next part of verse 11. Let's go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. He says, He has also set eternity in their heart. Now, why would God set eternity in our heart? How many of you know what that means before I start explaining this? What it means is, there's more to life than just now. There's got to be something out there after we die. Oh yeah, only man thinks about that. Animals don't. Trust me, your dog's not wondering if there's a heaven or a hell. Your dog might be smart, but he's not thinking if there's a heaven or a hell. But God set eternity in the heart of man. That's why at heart man is a worshipful creature, because God has set eternity in our heart. Now, why would God do that? Well, how many of you remember the story of Pandora's box? Do you remember what she did? Well, first of all, she wasn't supposed to open the box, but her curiosity got the best of her. So, being the woman that she was, she opened the box. Okay, I thought that was funny. And when she did open the box, she released diseases, sorrows, vices, and crimes that afflicted poor humanity. She quickly closed the box, but one thing was left in the box that didn't get out. How many of you remember what didn't get out? Hope. Now, eventually, being the woman she was, curiosity got the best of her, and she opened it up again, and hope got out. Hope was there to help man deal with the diseases, sorrow, vices, and suffering. Well, here's what's interesting. God has set eternity in our hearts for the very same reason. With eternity in our heart, we have hope. Eternity not only makes us seek God, but it motivates us to do the right thing at the right time, regardless of the circumstances. It helps us to see that there's more to life than just what we suffer here on this earth. Yeah. It helps us to believe and to see that there's a reward that's waiting for us in heaven if we do the appropriate thing, if we fulfill our task and do the right thing at the right time. Now, look at the last part of verse number 11. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. That's the NIV translation. I changed translations on you. Did you notice that? I went from the New American Standard to the NIV. We didn't read that. We read the New American Standard. Why? Because the NIV is a better translation. Notice what it says. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. In other words, we don't know what the future holds, but we push on in spite of that. We push on in hope. And when we start down a certain path, we don't always know what the outcome's going to be. And that's a good thing. Because we probably wouldn't go down certain paths if we knew what the outcome would be. But in the midst of the pain, God is there. And He's placed eternity in our hearts. Now look at verses 12 and 13. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. Now because of this hope that God has placed inside of us, we can enjoy life no matter what. It's not that life is not going to be painful at times. And the appropriate response at times might be to weep. But we can still enjoy life in the good times and in the bad times because God is with us and He has set eternity in our hearts, and we know that this is not the end. I might be going through a rough time. I might be suffering. I might have some pain. But this is not the end. So we just need to keep plodding on. You see, knowing that there's going to be joy in this life and grief and happiness and sadness, fun and disappointment, I need to simply enjoy life the best that I can and do good. I need to do the right thing at the right time. And people, that is my task as a person and as a pastor. And that's your task too, to do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time, whether it's a good season or a bad season, whether a good circumstance came or a bad circumstance came, there's an appropriate response that God wants you to make? Yeah. Let me just tell you right up front. After 34 years full-time ministry, I know my future. I know in the future that I will be doing funerals for people I love. I know I will be comforting parents with troubled children. And some parents who've lost their children. I know I'm going to be visiting hospitals. Because that's my task. When those times come, the appropriate thing to do is to do that funeral. To go visit those parents. To go pray for those people in the hospital. But I'll be honest with you, sometimes I just want to throw my hands up in despair and say, what's the use? And remember, that's what verses 9 and 10, that's what those two verses were saying. But I don't throw up my hands and quit. Instead, I continue to do the right thing at the right time. The appropriate response at the appropriate time. Why? Well, look at verses 14 and 15. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There's nothing to add to it and there's nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. That which has been already and that which will be has already been. For God seeks what has passed by. I know that's kind of difficult to understand, and that's even the New American Standard. But you have to remember, this was written 300 years ago, and it's considered poetry. So let me explain what he's saying here. Notice that he says, God's works remain forever, and he seeks what has passed by. Now I want you to underline that word seeks. Seeks is translated from the Hebrew word bakash, and it means to require or to exact in a legal sense. So what Solomon was saying is that God will require us to give an account for all of our past actions. He will seek what has passed by. In other words, he will judge our works. And if our works are good, they will remain and we'll receive a reward. If they're not good, they won't remain and we won't receive a reward. Now, Paul said the very same thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. Notice what it says. Now, if any man lays on that foundation gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest or revealed. For the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire. And the fire shall try every man's works of what sort it is. If any man's works abide, which he is built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. If his works don't remain, exactly what Solomon was saying, no reward. And now that Solomon's on the subject of judgment, he begins comparing man's judgment with God's judgment. Look at verses 16 and 17. Furthermore, I have seen under the sun, very important phrase, that in the place of justice there is wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there. Now, verse 16 is man's judgment without God in the picture. Remember what the phrase under the sun means. That phrase is a Hebraism and it means without God. So what Solomon is saying is that man's judgment apart from God is unjust and fair. Why? Because we can only judge based on what we see. Only God sees everything. Only God sees the motives and intentions of other people. Only God can see what people are thinking. So even if a man is a just judge, it's still not going to be just many times and fair. Yeah. And that's what he's saying. Man's judgment apart from God is unjust and fair. But verse 17 says that God's judgment is coming, and guess what? It's righteous. It is just and fair. Now, look at the last part of verse 17 concerning God's judgment. God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man for a time, for every matter and for every deed is there. In other words, everything we've ever done will be judged. And the question will be, did we do what was right or appropriate in the good times as well as the bad? In other words, no matter what circumstances come your way, you have a chance to shine and be rewarded by performing your task, which is what? To do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time. When circumstances come and occasions arise, whatever appropriate response is, if you do it, then your works will remain. If they don't, you'll be judged. Now, in verses 18 through 21, Solomon begins to compare man with beast, showing the similarities and the differences. Look at those verses. I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place, all came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? Now again, some people read this by itself, not in context of what other things Solomon wrote, and they misunderstand it. But here's what I want you to see. Again, he's talking about the sons of Adam. In other words, unregenerate man. We know that because the word man is translated from the Hebrew word Adam, not Ish. Now, how are the sons of men like beasts? Because that's what Solomon says. He says men are just like beasts. How are they the same? Well, we both die and our bodies decompose. Both of our lives are short-lived and of little consequence. But there's one major difference. Look at verse 21. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of beast descends downward to the earth? Now, I want you to underline the word breath. Breath is translated from the Hebrew word ruach, and it literally means spirit. Most of you don't know this. I'll just throw this in, won't prove it right now. But the spirit and soul are always joined together. They're two different things, two distinct things. But you can say the spirit goes to heaven when a person dies, and you need to understand, you can say the soul goes. Why? The spirit and the soul are always joined together. Now notice what this says. The spirit of beast descends down and it's gone. Why? Because it's not eternal. But the spirit of man ascends upward back to God who gave it. Turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse number 7, and I want you to see where Solomon elaborated on this. Notice what he said. Again, let's not take it out of context. Let's put it in the whole context of what Solomon wrote. He said, then the dust will return to the earth as it was. In other words, your bodies will decompose. And the spirit will return to God who gave it. What does that mean? It means that it goes back to God, and he determines whether that spirit goes to heaven or to hell. If you've accepted Jesus Christ, it goes to heaven. If you've not accepted Jesus Christ, God's in control, and it doesn't go to heaven. It goes to hell. Now, I want you to notice that verse number 21, chapter 3, is put into the form of a question. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? Who knows this? Believers. Yeah. We know as believers that there is a God, and we know that there is life after death. And that's what he's asking. Who knows this? Those who believe in God. Now, look at the last verse in chapter 3, which is verse 22. We're going to end with this. And I have seen that nothing is better than that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. Underline that word lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? Now, this isn't supposed to bum us out. Instead, this is supposed to give us hope. So, while we're here on this earth, we're supposed to enjoy our life. And whatever circumstances come our way, we won't complain, but we'll face them head on. And we'll do the right thing at the right time. Why? Well, look at verse 22. He says, for that is our lot. In other words, that's our task. Now, it doesn't mean that I won't work at controlling the circumstances so I can have more good times than bad. I will, but at the same time, when something bad does happen that's beyond my control, I'm not going to blame God. No, I'm going to work with him to overcome the circumstances. Because as the last part of verse 22 says, God will bring me to see what will occur after me. In other words, on the judgment day, I'll see how my good works affected others. And I'll see the consequences of my actions long after I've gone. Because God will bring me to see them. So as I said, Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is an explanation of how life works. And this is what I want you to see. We can manipulate situations and circumstances to a certain degree. And so when it's the appropriate time for something, our task is to do the appropriate thing or the appropriate response. When you're young and you're going to school, what's the appropriate thing to do? Learn. Learn. You come to church, what are you supposed to do? Learn. Yeah, you're laying the foundation. Why? It's not so you can have the pinnacle of your life be high school. Oh, you're the captain of the football team. You're the homecoming queen. None of that's going to matter. What's going to matter is what you do in your lifetime, and this is only preparation. So now you graduate from high school. What are you going to do? You're going to go prepare for your career. It might be a trade school. It might be college. It might be you're just going to go out and work, do whatever you want to do. I want you to understand something. How you manipulate these situations and these circumstances will determine whether you have more good times or bad times. You pick some type of career that you're not going to make the money to live the type of lifestyle you want. I want you to understand you're not going to have as many good times as you want to have. That's just the way life works. So you take advantage of the time to do the appropriate thing. You prepare the career, then you've got to choose who's going to be your spouse. That looks like a 5, doesn't it? We'll do that. So you start dating. You make the wrong choice, let me tell you, you can have life hell on earth. That's just the way it is. But you're going to have more bad times than you're going to have good times. So how you respond during this dating period, if you do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time and you see red flags and say, nope, not going to marry that person. Many of you are thinking right now, man, I married this person and they've been a chain. Oh, yeah. What was wrong? At the appropriate time that you should have been dating and looking for who would make a good mate, you weren't. You fell in love with that person. And now you're thinking, how in the world did I ever fall in love with him? Yeah. But you can do everything right. You can go to school, you can prepare your career, you can get the right person to marry you, you can have a great job, you can be doing good things at that job, and then all of a sudden, boom, you go to the doctor, you find out you have health problems. You can control certain circumstances, you can control certain situations, but let me just tell you something, life doesn't work in a way that you can control everything. Or maybe it's not that. Maybe all of a sudden you get a phone call and your mama's dead or your daddy's dead. And maybe they didn't prepare. So now you're going to have to financially help take care of your mama. Yeah. But here's what's interesting. Your task is to do the right thing at the right time. The appropriate thing at the appropriate time. And here's what's interesting in life. If we do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time, we will manipulate the majority of circumstances so that we'll have more good times. That's supposed to be good. Than bad times. If we don't do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time, we're going to have more bad times than good times. But here's the thing I want you to understand. Sometimes life really throws you a curveball and you think, I don't know how I can do this. I want you to understand, God has set eternity in your heart, and you know that this is not the end. So in the midst of it, you do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time, and God will strengthen you. He will enable you. And I promise you, when this life ends, you're going to receive a crown and you're going to receive rewards. Let me tell you, in 34 years of preaching, there have been some times I did not want to come up here and preach because of things I was going through, things that had happened to my children, things that had happened in my family, things that had happened in the church. And I go before God and say, oh God, I just need to take a vacation. Maybe I can call someone. Back then I didn't have an associate pastor. And that's one of the elders to preach. And God would always bring that scripture back to mind. Preach the word in season and out of season, in good times and in bad times. And so I'd suck it up. I said, all right, God, I'm going to do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time. And you know what? God would always strengthen me. He'd always give me a supernatural ability to get up and preach the word. And He'd always bless me as a result of that. And I can promise you, even though I've had my share of bad things, I've had so many more good times than bad times. And I'm looking forward to the time that I go to heaven. Because I expect to get rewards. Why? Because Solomon told me, you want rewards? Then you know that there's a time for everything. And God has appointed a time for everything. And everything's appropriate in its time. In other words, God says, if you do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time, I'm going to bless it, and you're going to receive a reward.